We begin, though, with a stark warning about the levels of indoctrination that children are undergoing in territories controlled by the Islamic State group. The UN-endorsed report, called Children of Islamic State, suggests that militants are normalising children to violence by making them watch executions and play football with severed heads, breeding a new generation of suicide bombers, spies and executioners. Here's an excerpt from the report.
The current generation of fighters sees children as better and more lethal fighters than themselves. Rather than being converted into radical ideologies, children have been indoctrinated into extreme values from birth or at a young age. Boys learn a rigid Islamic State curriculum where drawing, philosophy and social studies have been removed. Instead, children churn out memorized verses of the Quran and attend jihadi training, which includes shooting, weaponry and martial arts. Girls, also known as the pearls of the caliphate, are veiled, hidden, confined to the home and taught to look after their husbands.
Nikita Malik is a senior researcher with the Quilliam Foundation, an anti-radicalisation research organisation, and she's the co-author of the report. Just give us a bit more detail, if you will, of what you found.
Sure. The report has been endorsed by UNESCO and the Child Soldiers Initiative. The report was really broken down into 4 different aspects. The first was an understanding of the historical and legal perspective. What I mean by historical is the way that the Islamic State uses children is unfortunately not new. It has elements of the way that the Nazis used to use youth groups, how the Ba'athist Party used children, how they used to look at cubs as future fighters. The reason we analysed the legislative background was because all countries have a territorial responsibility to children who would have gone to join Islamic State should they choose to escape or return. So we really wanted to contextualise it first. Then over a 6-month period leading up to February 2016, we analysed all Islamic State propaganda released by the Islamic State, whether it was videos, photographs, images, documents that featured children. We found 254 pieces of unique propaganda, and we categorized them, we codified them. What we found was that children are, for the most part, used for violence, either to commit acts of violence themselves, brutal acts of violence, or or they're normalized to violence. So they're watching videos of beheadings, they're counting whippings, and then the other part we found, which was quite unique, was that some of the videos they release are for their state building or utopia building project, because they aren't an army, they are also a state, and a state requires a generation of soldiers, a generation of mujahideen. And so we looked at the textbooks that were used, the pictures and what was released, what these children are being taught. And it was very disturbing indeed, because even in these textbooks, there's a normalization of violence.
Were you able to get any testimonies smuggled out, or were you relying on these propaganda videos?
We were relying on the propaganda videos, so there is an element of bias there, because if you have a young child speaking to the camera, what they tend to do is the children who are best at speaking will be put in the forefront of cameras. They will be rewarded that way. Speaking to the camera, talking about how great Islamic State is, what they're trying to show is for families who would be thinking about making the journey, making migration. Videos like this show that there's an infrastructure in place for their children to be educated that is more pure, that is more clean than what they're being taught in corrupt societies, not just Western societies, because the Islamic State sees Saudi Arabia as corrupt as well.
And briefly, is there anything in what you found that could give clues as to the way forward, how to help these children?
Absolutely. What we based our policy recommendations were based on what we found. These children are going to have severe mental and physical trauma. Many of them will be suffering with PTSD, and that's why it was so important to have UNESCO and to have child soldiers on board. There is a precedent, there is a policy in place for how child soldiers are treated, but this is a completely different league of educational religious indoctrination, which will require a unique approach.
Nikita Malik, the co-author of that report, senior researcher at the Quilliam Foundation. Thanks very much. Well, NewsHour's Lise Doucette is in the Syrian capital, Damascus, and just before we came on air, she gave me her reflections on the report.
This absolutely dreadful report, in the sense of the conclusions that it is bringing to us, confirming some of what we already knew about what the fighters of the so-called Islamic State are doing to the children reminds us that in a war where children have been paying an incredibly high price, that along comes an armed group, not just ready to allow children to be caught up in this conflict, they are targeting them in a way to ensure that this conflict has no end, taking children away from their parents, from their schools, from the places they hold dear, and taking them to a place where they'll be brainwashed in such a way and at such a young age that the continuation of this brutal ideology of the Islamic State will be set to continue. It's an absolutely frightening glimpse into the future. And I think one of the statistics that made me pause for thought in a war, not just in Syria, but also neighboring Iraq, that shocks on an almost daily basis, is to hear that in the Iraqi city of Mosul, 800 to 900 children had been taken from their families to be sent to these education so-called camps of the so-called Islamic State. And so these details of this absolutely savage group is doing to children is it an even more chilling reminder of an all too chilling war.
And Lise, you have reported a lot on wars, but specifically on the effects they've had on children. A couple of years ago, you made a documentary for BBC television called Children of Syria. Let's have a listen to some of the children you interviewed for it.
The siege was really hard. We ended up eating cats. At our home there were about 40 rats. We had a cat. She would eat them all. Then a month later they slaughtered her. We got hold of some meat. They didn't tell us what it was at first. We ate it, and the next day they told us that it was cat meat.
When there were explosions, when you used to hear the guns, what did you do?
We used to cover our ears not to hear the sound of explosion. I can't hear well, and neither do my sisters. It was as if gunfire was right next to us, next to our ears. Instead of learning to read and write these days, I learn about weapons. I know the names of bullets, tracers, and rubber bullets.
I'm only a child in age and appearance, but in terms of humanity, I'm not. In the past, a 12-year-old was considered young, but not anymore. Now, at 12 years old, you must fight for jihad.
Before the crisis, I was a child who played and had fun. I never thought of anything like politics and war. The crisis changed us. Now children understand and talk about politics. We are ready to die for our country. Both my uncles were martyred. I was very happy about it. They made us proud.
And Lise, just wonder your reflections on war itself as a force for changing children, for radicalising them, if you like, as well as having other effects on them.
Civilians have always suffered at times of war. It's been a reality of war since wars began. But I think the wars of our time are being fought in a way that no longer are children, women, the innocent on the front line. They have become the front line. One of the things that marked the start of the Syrian war 5 years ago was how children from the very beginning were targeted, were tortured. They weren't, just to use that really unfortunate phrase, caught in the crossfire or caught up in the conflict. They were front and center of the actions taken by armed groups, and most of all by the Syrian government, to try not just to inflict maximum pain, but to terrorize communities. And what we have seen in the past 5 years in Syria is that with so many armed groups and with all sides willing to use food and medicine as weapons of war, that children have seen their schools come under attack, their homes come under fire, their neighborhood shattered, their society torn to shreds, such that the children are given such little chance at any kind of a future. And we found, from the very beginning in coming to Syria during this war, that it was so apparent how children were paying this heavy price. But not only were they going through such terrible things, they were able to articulate what had happened to them, and they provided an absolutely dreadful glimpse of an even more terrible future.